Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. Good afternoon. The United States of America likes to call itself a nation of immigrants. But when it does that, it is really trying to erase two groups of people, two demographics that never immigrated to become a part of this nation. It's trying to erase African Americans who were kidnapped, shipped over here, and enslaved to build this nation and never immigrated here to be citizens of this country. And it excludes Native Americans who were living here, hunting here, fishing here, raising our families here, burying our dead here, long before Columbus got lost at sea. And so we need to talk about what does it mean for especially these two demographics. And today I'm going to be talking about Native Americans to be citizens of this nation. This is the 100-year anniversary, 2024, 100 years ago. The U.S. Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. This is seen largely as a very positive step by this government to make American Indians full citizens here in the United States. But today I want to put this act in its proper historical context. I want to talk about what does that actually mean and what do we need to do with this. My name is Mark Charles. I am a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. I am the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. And I am working hard to build a nation where we the people actually means all the people. I ran for president in 2024 with that as my vision. I believe we need a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. I'm working to build a common memory so that for the very first time in our nation, we might have a healthier community across racial lines. In our Navajo culture, we would call that walking in beauty. So I invite you to join me for my discussion today. Every couple times a week, I like to sit down over my second cup of coffee, talk about these things, and explore how might we be able to learn how to walk in beauty together. Thanks for being here. So I missed yesterday. I usually like to do my second cups of coffee on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but I'm working on an op-ed that I'm writing, and the op-ed is for Native News Online, and they asked me to write an article about the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. It was passed officially on June 2nd of 1924, so this coming June will be the 100th anniversary of that act. And they've asked several other public figures and writers and activists to be a part of this and to write op-eds. I believe Deb Holland submitted an op-ed for this, and there's a few other people who have done this. And so I was very honored when they asked me to write this, and I've been pondering it for really about 2 months. They asked me, it was sometime back in February or early March maybe. And I've been pondering it. I've been actually working on this article for about almost a month now. And I don't quite have it. I'm very close. And so I thought, hey, I'm an extrovert. I have a second cup of coffee a couple of times a week. Maybe I'll sit down over my cup of coffee and talk about this Indian Citizenship Act and see if it kind of brings some of my thoughts together. Before I begin, I want to do like I always do and acknowledge that I am here in Washington, D.C. My Navajo people call this Washington. This is the land of the Piscataway. So I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the land where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. Let me see who's on here with me. I know there's a few people who jumped on pretty early. Jermaine, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for being here. It's good to see you today. I'm glad you could join me today. Shantina, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining me. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine is. I actually bought a couple good of my favorite local roasts here this week when I was back in DC after my travels, and so I'm enjoying some good cups of coffee right now. But yeah, let's talk about the Indian Citizenship Act. First of all, let's just talk about what the act is, and then we'll put it into its historical context. So on June 2nd of 1924, Congress passed what they called the Indian Citizenship Act. This is a PDF from the National Archives website of the act. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so we can actually read it. This is the header for the act, when it was passed and everything else, and this is the act itself. It says, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States be, and they are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian or tribal or other property. You see, prior to 1924, we were not considered to be citizens of the United States. You could become a citizen. That usually involved buying land and paying taxes. It involved leaving your tribal community and going to an urban or a suburban environment and living and setting up your home there. It sometimes even involved renouncing your allegiance to your tribe and assimilating to American culture, language, and economic systems. It was citizenship came with a lot of things that meant you had to kill the Indian in order to save the man. That's essentially what citizenship meant for so many people. And so when they passed this act in 2024, right, there's several things that are interesting about this act. Because first of all, it doesn't ask if we want to be citizens. It just declares us all suddenly to be citizens, whether we wanted this right or not. And second, it specifically says towards the end that we're citizens provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian or tribal or other property. Meaning not only were they declaring us citizens, but they were not requiring us to renounce our allegiance to our citizenship in the native nations that we were already a part of. And so, in a lot of ways, this sounds like a great deal, right? We get to become citizens of this nation that people from all over the world are immigrating across oceans and deserts and rivers to come and be a part of this nation. And now suddenly hundreds of thousands of Native Americans are, boom, granted citizenship within the state, within this country. But again, we have to understand the goal of the United States, the struggle of Native Americans, of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, and the history. We have to put this in historical context, right? So obviously, we have to first start talking about the doctrine of discovery, 1492, right? We have the doctrine of discovery: invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit, right? This is the doctrine that not only gave European nations the right, the ecclesiastical right, or the justification from the church to go into continents like Africa, colonize the land and kidnap the people and bring them to places like the New World and enslave them. But it's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and to claim to have discovered it. Right? The first sentence of the first chapter of my book, Unsettling Truth, says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands. You can't discover them unless your worldview informs you, or your church informs you, that the people living there are not fully human. So this was how this contact first began with European nations coming over here. Then in 1622, after the Great Dying of 1616 to 1619, where due to disease and other things, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of native nations and native peoples were wiped out due to the diseases brought over by these colonizers. And right after that happened, then King George, this is the same king who, or King James, I'm sorry, this is the same king who ordered the translation of the Bible. He went on to declare in the New England, in the Charter of New England, the Land Charter of New England, he said that whereas the where I can't read what it's saying here. There hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, together with many horrible slaughters and murders committed against the savages and brutish people, there heretofore inhibiting in a manner to the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of the whole territory, so that there is not left from any leagues under in any manner that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein, or any other superior lord or sovereign to make claims hereunto. And so, whereby we, in our judgment, are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time has come in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people, hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as they were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of our subjects and people as heretofore have and hereafter shall, by his mercy and favor, and by his powerful army, be directed and conducted thither. So King George got word that these lands were empty now. Villages were completely depopulated. The populations were entirely destroyed. And he said, oh, praise God. Now these lands belong to us and we can claim them and we have the right to them. And this is God's blessing that he wiped out these people so that we could come in and now claim the territory of these lands. This was the justification for the New England Land Charter of 1620. The Declaration of Independence, right? In the 1700s, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident: all men are created equal. 30 lines later, refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. After we say we the people of the United States, we define who the people is. It's not women, they never get mentioned. It's not black people, they're counted as 3/5. And it's not natives, because we're not taxed. So we're never meant to be a part of this nation. In 1823, we have Johnson v. Macintosh, two white European men litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got them from a native nation. The other got it from the U.S. government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court must determine the legal precedent for land titles. They determine that it is discovery that gives title to the land. And then because that might imply natives might have some kind of claim to the land because we were here first, he says, well, natives are savages and therefore they cannot possess the land. That clears the way for the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Long Walk for the Cherokee, the other nations. About a dozen nations experienced forced relocation, including my people, the Navajo people, after 1830 because of the Indian Removal Act. We have the Declaration of the Idea of Manifest Destiny in 1840, the belief that this white nation has the God-given right to rule Turtle Island from sea to shining sea. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln goes on a rampage across this continent, removing the Dakota Winnebago from Minnesota, the Shoshone from northern Utah and southern Idaho, the Cheyenne and Arapaho from eastern Colorado, and the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the southwest, clearly ethnically cleansing the northern, central, and southern routes of the Transcontinental Railway. And in the midst of that, declaring national days of thanksgiving, giving thanks to God for the fruits of the genocide that he's actively committing. And then in 1869, the Golden Spike is laid, northern Utah, southern Idaho area, literally a stone's throw in the vicinity of where the Bear River Massacre took place at the Shoshone by Abraham Lincoln just a few years earlier. In 1884, we have a Supreme Court case. It's Elk versus Wilkins. I'm going to put this into the chat here. This is an article about this in the Constitution Center. And I'm going to put this into the chat right now. And basically, it was a native man who was fighting for the right to vote. He left his tribe. He moved to a U.S. urban center. He bought property. He paid taxes. He assimilated to American language and culture and religion and everything else. And then he went to vote, and they said, no, you can't vote. And so he went to court, and they ruled. The Supreme Court ruled in 1884 that yes, Native Americans, even those who have become naturalized or whatever, left their nations, cannot vote. In 1887, the U.S. Congress passes the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act creates allotments of 160 acres that are assigned to individual Native American people. The land is taken away from the control of the tribe. It's given to individual people. If there's not enough people in the tribe to take up all the land allocated to that tribe, then they open it up to sale to non-native peoples. 90 million acres of land, 140,000 square miles, were lost to native nations as this land was sold to white people after the Dawes Act of 1887. I'm going to put a website here from the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and the Tenure Foundation, which talks about land tenure and the Dawes Act. Massacres continue to happen. We have Wounded Knee in 1890. We have the residential boarding schools, which start at that period. Again, the stated goal of these schools was to kill the Indian in order to save the man. American Indians fight in World War I, laying down their lives for this nation. And in 1924, they are granted citizenship, birthright citizenship in this nation due to the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which is the act we just read. The act specifically states we don't need to renounce our affiliation to our tribes. In fact, our citizenship is dependent upon the fact that this will not take away from our connection to our tribes. They don't ask us if we want to be citizens, they just grant it to us. I'm going to actually give you, if you want to see the act itself, I'm going to put this into the chat here. You can actually bring up the PDF from the archives that I put in there. Boarding schools continue to operate during these periods. My grandparents and other Native children were taken from their homes, brought to military-style boarding schools, punished for speaking their languages, punished for practicing their culture, abused emotionally, physically, sexually. Horrific things happen as the churches and the nation works to kill the Indian in order to save the man. And then in 1953, the U.S. changes policies, and instead of self-determination and trying to empower Native tribes and Native nations, they move to a Termination Act. Let me show you this act. I have it here. So they move to termination. You can get this on the link I just put there. We're not going to read the whole thing now. From that site, this is from the archives site of the U.S. government. Officially announced on August 1st, 1953, in House Concurrent Resolution 108, 67 Stat B 132, termination was expressly intended to make Indians within the territorial limits of the United States subject to the same laws and entitled to the same privileges and responsibilities that are applicable to other citizens of the United States, to end their status as wards of the U.S., and to grant them all the rights and prerogatives pertaining to American citizenship. This was despite the fact that American Indians had been U.S. citizens since Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. Congress used this act not only to disenroll hundreds of thousands of Native peoples from their tribes, but it also used this act to steal another 3 million acres, 467,000 square miles, from Native nations. So between the Dawes Act and the Termination Act, American Indians have now lost 144,000 square miles of land. If you want to have any idea how big that is, it's about the size of Montana, a little bit smaller than California. Montana is about 147,000 square miles. California is about 163,000 square miles. This isn't even including what happened in the Indian Removal Act and the other massacres that took place. This is even including the New England Land Charter and Native nations who were just wiped out and land was stolen from them. A 144,000 square miles of land stolen. The size of Montana. Just to bring this up to speed, right? You've heard me talk, my TEDx talk. As recently as 2005, the United Indian Nation is fighting to regain sovereignty over their lands. And an opinion written by none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg states that basically you're still savages and you do not have rights to your land. Bringing it up to speed, even in the past decade, in 2018, President Obama and Vice President Biden, but the Obama administration, they established the Mashpee Wampanoag Reservation. Now, again, unless you think this is about Native sovereignty, it's not, right? Native nations do not own the lands. We are not sovereign over the lands that we have as reservations. Those are trust lands. They are held for us by the U.S. government. We are wards of the U.S. government. We are not able to hold our own lands. In 2020, just before the pandemic hit, President Trump disestablished the Mashpee Wampanoag Reservation. And in 2020, Joe Biden responded during the campaign. And this is what he said. He said, one of the most important roles the federal government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship is taking lands into trust on behalf of tribes. It is critical for tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Now, this may not seem racist to you, but it's because you're used to white politicians speaking in this manner to Native people. You're used to it. So let's pretend, right, that he wasn't talking to Native nations. Let's pretend he was talking to one of our allies. Let's pretend he was talking to France and was saying to the French people, one of the most important roles the federal government, the U.S. government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship with the French people is taking lands into trust on behalf of France. This is critical for French sovereignty and French self-determination. We would never say that. At best, this would be a joke. At worst, it'd be a declaration of war. Could you imagine if Native nations said this to the US government? One of the most important roles the tribes play in rebuilding nation-to-nation relationship with the American people is taking land into trust on behalf of the United States federal government. This is critical for US sovereignty and US self-determination. That would be a declaration of war, right? That would bring out the nuclear weapons from the US government. They would never stand for that. But that's how they talk to Native peoples. Your sovereignty is dependent upon us being your ward. On top of this, right? In 2020, we had really the largest Native American presidential forum. There was one years earlier, but it wasn't attended by many of the top tier candidates. The one in 2020 in Iowa, right? We had Bernie Sanders was there. Who else was there? Many of the top candidates showed up at this event. Elizabeth Warren was there. Many of the top candidates showed up there. You know who didn't show up? You know who didn't come? It was the first time top tier candidates running for president came to a Native American forum to talk directly to Native peoples. And you know who didn't show up? Joe Biden and Donald Trump. They didn't show up. And of course, Donald Trump's the one who disestablished the Mashpee Wampanoag Reservation, and Joe Biden's the one who said, you're still wards of the state. So we just have to be absolutely clear. Citizenship was never the goal of the United States of America. That was never the goal. That was never what they were trying to do. The goal the entire time was land acquisition. That was the goal. The United States of America wanted our land, and they didn't want to keep their treaty responsibilities. So in 1924, they benevolently, right, just declared all American Indians were now birthright citizens of the United States. And they said this will not impact your land or your rights within Indian country with your native nations. And then in 1953, they changed their policy and they began terminating nations, disenrolling native peoples, and stealing our lands once again. If you're wondering, this is why I actually have began several years ago being very, very clear. I am a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation, right? My mother was American of Dutch heritage. My father is Navajo. I am a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. And what I'm learning as I've been working for a long time to try to wrestle with these systemic problems, what I'm learning is that the United States of America may begrudgingly be willing to slowly allow me as a Native man or other Native peoples more rights as individual citizens, right? Even the whole thing with land titles, right? It's not that as a Native American, I can't go buy a house. I could. What the government's adamant about is my nation, the Navajo Nation, does not have sovereignty over our lands. We're a subordinate to the United States of America. We are the wards of their state. And they are adamant about maintaining that oppressive relationship. Now, we got to just be honest, right? It's interesting. I've actually saw a few articles. I wasn't able to quote them, but there were a few articles that said one of the debates in 1924, when they were debating the Indian Citizenship Act, was should they use the term citizen or full citizen in this act? And they chose not to use the word full, declared to be citizens of the United States. So what did this mean? Well, this meant that until as recently as 1948, right, 24 years after the Indian Citizenship Act, states like Arizona and New Mexico were still legally preventing Native peoples from voting. The citizenship we were being offered was not the full citizenship of a white landowning male. The citizenship we were being offered was very akin to the citizenship being begrudgingly granted to African Americans and women and other people of color. And that's clearly demonstrated in the fact that we did not get a federal right to vote until as recently as 1948. So yeah, we have to be clear. You're going to hear more and more over these next few months as the U.S. government's going to tout the fact that, look, we made you citizens. This was a benevolent thing. How great of a thing? What does it feel like to be citizen of the United States? And we just have to remember the goal was not back then and currently is not full citizenship. That's not the goal. The goal always has been land acquisition. This is one of the reasons why in 2024 or in 2020, I ran for president. 4 years ago, I announced my candidacy in the 2020 election. And actually, it was about 5 years ago. 2019 is when I announced. And what I'm trying to do is to use my full rights as an American citizen to help my nation, the United States of America, acknowledge and recognize and respect the agency and the status of my Navajo Nation. I'm trying to use my rights as a citizen of the United States to fight for the rights of my Navajo Nation. And I'm not even saying I'm doing the best thing. I don't know. There's a lot of Native peoples who have responded differently to this act. There are many nations. Actually, when they signed the bill, there were several nations that actually protested the passing of this bill. We don't want to be citizens of the United States. We have a treaty with the U.S. government. We want to have our own separate and sovereign nation and have diplomatic relationship with the United States. We don't want to become citizens of your country. So there's been a broad range of discussion, even throughout Indian country, within Native circles, about how do we respond to this? What do we do? And I'm not positive I have the best response, right? I'm trying to work within the system. But there's a lot of other people doing very good work trying to press these issues at many different levels. And I think that's what's necessary. That's what's needed. So the Indian Citizenship Act, it's a handful. It's hard to know how to respond to it. It's hard to know what's the best way to do this and the best way to move forward. The best way is I want the U.S. government to acknowledge the agency and the sovereignty of Native nations. And I want, through my identifying myself as a dual citizen, to both humble the U.S. government's attitude and to empower my Navajo Nation's government's position in this debate. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Like I said, I'm writing this op-ed. I'm going to try to wrap this up over the next week or so before I submit it to Native News Online. I think they're going to do a special. They're going to run these op-eds in early June, I believe. I'm not sure exactly of it all, but I think they're going to be doing that. So anyway, yeah, it's and you'll get to see a wide spectrum of responses and reactions to people of what's going to happen and how this is going to come out and what's it going to look like. What's the debate going to be? So I encourage you to enjoy and engage in that dialogue. But my relatives, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining me for a cup of coffee. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine is. I see Russell. Yá'át'ééh. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Susan. Yá'át'ééh, Susan. Thank you for being here. Shantina and Mary and others who are putting comments in here. George. Yá'át'ééh. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your comments that you make in here. I always go back and read them after the show. And I try to, if I need to or can, I incorporate them into discussions or Q&As later. But so thank you for leaving those comments. But I appreciate everybody. And thank you that you could join me for a cup of coffee. Walk in beauty, my relatives. Oh, wait, I want to share something with you. If you like what I'm trying to do, if you like the work I'm trying to do and want to help me or partner with me in trying to make this happen, I invite you to follow me on Patreon. You can follow me for free. You can also subscribe to me there. I have an Ask Questions tier. I have a Decolonizing Faith tier. I have a basic supporters tier. There's a lot of ways that you can deepen your engagement with this content and even your engagement with me on my Patreon site. And I invite you to do that. Second, I want to make sure I highlight that I wrote out about a lot of these issues, not the Indian Citizenship Act, but the other stuff I discussed in the book I co-authored with Seung-Chan Rah, Unsettling Truths. I welcome you to get a copy of that book. You can get signed copies from my website. And then if you want to share this podcast with someone or even listen to it again, we actually have a podcast and it's on the podcast site. I'm sharing the link to Spotify, but you can get on Apple or the other major podcast websites. And so there's a lot of places. Sometimes I call that my second cup of coffee to go. So you can take that in your headphones and listen to it while you're driving or you're running or you're walking or doing something else, doing work outside. But anyway, you can grab this as a podcast if you'd like to. Anyway, my relatives, walk in beauty. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakona.